Today, we're tackling something every developer deals with, forms, specifically in Next.js 15. Forms are essential in web development, whether you're collecting user feedback, submitting in-game stats, or simply allowing a user to log into your app. Forms are something you are definitely going to come across in your developer journey. Let's look at how this works in the app router. So if you don't already know or don't remember, server actions allow you to execute server-side logic in your client components without the need to set up traditional API routes. So in the case of forms, that means that we can process our forms without having to set up a traditional API route. It makes things a lot simpler. And the app router, for all of you who don't know or need a refresher, it simplifies the routing and structure of your project. So let's talk about the basics. Here in the browser, you can see we have a simple form. We have a simple search input field along with the submit button. What do you think the default behavior would be if I type in an input value and submit it? Well, let's go ahead and check that out. So if we go ahead into this input field and type in subscribe for more content. Oh, wow, look at that. And click submit. Let's see what happens. So after we press submit with our value, you can see that our value was cleared. The page made a GET request to itself, and our value was appended to our URL as a query parameter. So in this case, the query param name is search and the value is subscribe for more content. So this is the default behavior of forms in the browser with no action on them. So if we look in our code, we will notice that the page and the form itself are all server components. Remember, by default in Next.js 15, every component that you make is a server component by default unless you specify otherwise using the use client directive at the top of your page. Server components do not have access to browser functionality like on click, on change, etc., like the React hooks, use effect. None of that stuff is available in server components. If you aren't familiar with server components or need a refresher, check out my previous video where we talked about server components in detail. One of the ways that you can invoke server actions is through the action property of the form element. So one of the cool things about the form action prop is that you can pass a string instead of a function. This is really useful when you want to route users to a different page in your app when they submit something. So for example, in the case of our search form, it would be nice to direct the user to a search results page where they can see the results of their query, right? In our search form component, we've added in an action prop to our form element, and instead of passing in a server action, we're passing in a string. So in this case, we're passing a string search. So this should route users to our search page whenever they submit something in our search form component. So let's go ahead and try to test this out in the browser. Coming back to our form in the browser, if we go ahead and try to type in and submit a new value on our search form, we would expect to be routed to our search page with the new action that we provided. So let's go ahead and submit our form. And we can see that we were successfully routed to our search page with our value appended in the URL as before. But we got a 404, and we know this is because we have not defined our search page just yet. So coming back to our code base, we've defined a new search folder within our app router, and inside of this search folder, we've made a page.tsx file. So remember, if you don't have a page.tsx file defined, your route or your page will not be accessible in the browser. So inside of our page file, we define a new type called search params, and our page takes in some props called search params with the same type. So this means that we're going to be reading from the URL to get that query param value that users see when they submit their form. So this is something we're going to be covering in a later video in greater detail. So make sure you subscribe so you do not miss that vid. So in regards to this section right now, all we're going to be doing is taking in that query param and just showing it to the user. So in a simple sentence, basically saying, so you're looking for whatever you entered, correct? So let's go ahead and see how this works in the browser. So coming back to the page, you can see we no longer have that 404 error. That's because we successfully defined our search page. So moving on in, you can see now we have our string rendering correctly. Again, all it did was take from the query params. In this case, our query param name is search, and the value that we typed in is content. So we're displaying that string, so you're looking for content, correct? If I typed in something else, this value would change to match. Typically, in these cases with search results, you'll want to end up fetching some data from a database or an external API and render it to the user. So for example, in this case, I typed in content. I would probably want to be shown a list of posts or something that have the string content inside of it, or however my logic is set up. But that's typically how cool this feature is, or how it can be useful when you're trying to have a search page. Now that we're starting to pick up on things, let's look at how we can use server actions to process forms submitted by users. Here we have a basic contact form with a few fields that we want the user to submit. Let's take a look at how we can leverage server actions to handle this. In our code base, we created a new actions directory inside of our app router, and inside of this new actions directory, we created an index.ts file, and this is going to house our server action for this example. The most important thing to note about this file is the use server directive at the top of the page. This tells Next.js that every function in this file will run exclusively on the server. This will allow us to use our server actions in both our server and client components. Notice how simple it is to set up. No need to manually set up an API route. If you aren't familiar with this directive, or you want to learn more about server actions, check out my video where we talked about this in detail. Now, coming back to the code, for now, our server action simply logs a message to the terminal, but we're going to be adding in more logic. Since our server action will be invoked from a form, we had to specify the parameter form data, since it automatically will receive a form data object on submission. And then we can use the native form data methods to extract data as needed. For now, our function is relatively simple. It extracts data and just console logs it out to the terminal for us. Now that we successfully set up our server action, let's try to invoke it from our form component to see if it's working correctly. So to go ahead and add it to the form component, we need to add the action prop. And inside the action prop, we simply call in our action that we defined, add contact action, and let's see how this behaves in the browser. So let's go ahead and enter some test data into our form, and let's see if our server action is being invoked correctly. So when we hit submit, we would expect our console log to show in our server terminal. So let's go ahead and see what happens. So like we talked about earlier, when you press submit, the default behavior is to clear out the form. We can see here that it made a post request, and remember, server actions can only be invoked using the post request method. Let's go ahead and check in our code to see what happened. So it looks like it was successful. We can see that our console log did run. Everything that we entered was successfully printed into the console log. Now that we successfully wired our server action into our form, let's talk about one of the most important parts: processing and validating our data. A form isn't a form without validation, right? All our form does right now is just process data and console logs it out. We need a way to make sure that what the user entered is correct. So let's go ahead and beef up our server action by adding in some simple validation rules. Coming back to our code base, we managed to beef things up a bit with some basic validation. So what have we done? We basically made sure that every field in our contact form can't be blank or empty. So we're making checks to make sure that 1, the input isn't null, or 2, the input isn't just a bunch of empty spaces. We've also created a new errors object that will store specific errors for each field as they come about. And we've also added in a basic email validator. This function takes in an email and it makes sure that 1, if it's empty, it's just going to return false, resulting in an error coming back to the user. And then 2, it makes sure that the email passes basic regex. So if it's a weird email that doesn't pass this regex string, it's going to return false. Good emails will return true. So we've managed to update our server action with some basic validation. So now let's go ahead and see how this actually behaves in our browser. Now that we have some basic server validation logic in place, let's go ahead and try to submit our form with none of the information entered. Remember, all of our form fields are required according to our backend logic. So let's go ahead and see what happens. So we click submit. Again, our action is invoked using the post method, post HTTP method. Now let's go back to our code and let's see what we're getting. So it does look like we have some errors and our logic is working correctly. You can see we get the message unable to process form, success false, and you can see all the errors for the fields that are required because they are all empty. Let's quickly talk about the React hook useActionState. With React 19 now being fully released, we were introduced to a new hook, useActionState. What is useActionState? So it's a React hook that allows you to update some state based on the result of a form action. It allows you to connect some state between the server action and the form or component that rendered it. In earlier Canary versions before React 19 fully released, this hook was called useFormState, and it was part of the React DOM. And also, since this is a React hook, this can only be used in client components. Here's what you need to know about the useActionState hook in React 19. The first parameter is the function that you want to call when the form is submitted. The second parameter is the initial state, the value that you want the state to be initially. Note, when the function is first called, it'll receive this value, but afterwards, this value will be ignored. And the last param is an optional permalink value. This is a string containing the unique page URL that this form modifies. The useActionState hook returns an array with the following items. The first one being the current state of the form, which is initially set to the initial state param that you provide. After the form is submitted, it's set to the return value of the action that you provide to it. Second is the new action that you're providing to the form as its action prop. And 3, a pending state that you can take advantage of while the action is processing. Let's take a look at how this will work by modifying our current ContactForm component. We've made a few changes to our ContactForm component in order to integrate with the useActionState hook. The first and most notable change is the use client directive at the top of the page. Originally, our ContactForm was a server component, but since we're using a React hook now, we had to use the use client directive to make this a client component. We've also imported and declared the useActionState hook. So remember, the useActionState hook takes in 3 params, one of which is optional, so we've only passed 2 of these parameters in this case. The action that we want to invoke when the form is submitted, and our initial state, which we're declaring up here to be a type ContactForm state. This is just a custom type that we've defined for our form. In this case, it's just an object of errors, a success, which is a Boolean, true or false, and then a string message. Something important to note is that the action that we provide, in this case, is our add contact action. It'll receive a new first argument to its function signature, namely the current state of the form. So you've probably already seen that our editor is throwing an error saying, hey, this isn't correct. So this basically means what we just talked about. We need to update the signature of our add contact server action to receive a new state, or the state of the form, because right now it only takes in form data. So let's go ahead and fix this error by providing a new signature value we'll call it previous state in this case. And we're going to also make it the same state that we define our initial state to be. And the last thing that we need to do is make our server action return the state that we're initializing it to be here. So in this case, we need it to return ContactForm state instead of just returning a void promise. So let's go ahead and change that to this. And then we can also update our return statement here. So let's remove our console logs. And now if we go back to our ContactForm, we notice that the error is no longer there. So now we can successfully take advantage of the useActionState hook. You can see here we're already using the is pending value that's returned from that hook. So in this case, we're disabling the button whenever this action is processing, so we don't have users spamming submit while the action is taking place. And we're also changing the text. So whenever the process is going on, the text will change to submitting instead of submit. Now that we successfully set up our ContactForm to use the useActionState hook, let's go ahead and verify this in the browser. Navigating to the browser, we see that we have our console log going. So this shows that our initial form state is to what we set it as. So basically an empty state, success false, and no message at the time being. So let's go ahead and try to submit our ContactForm, and let's see what happens. So now we can actually see the state update. So now, instead of just getting a blank state like we started with, we're able to see the return type coming through like we set it as. So we're able to see our errors and our message and the success Boolean being false. Instead of it having to be on the server, we can actually see this in our client now, because remember, this form is now a client component. Now that we're actually getting some state back from our form, it probably isn't the best user experience just to keep showing no errors to the user, huh? So let's modify this form component a little bit just to show, highlight the fields that have an error and actually show some messaging to the user so they know what they have to correct. So in our code base, we made a couple of updates to make our form a little bit more user friendly. So whenever there's an error, we make the border for that specific input field red, and we also display a message to the user under that specific field saying, hey, this field is required. We also made an update to show an error message under our button as well. So it's a little bit more user friendly. So let's actually see how this works in real time. So if we navigate back to our browser and submit an empty form again, well, no, better yet, let's actually just submit, let's have one blank field. So let's leave the email field empty and let's submit everything else. So when we submit it, let's see what happens. So now we can see things are a little bit more user friendly. The border color changed to red, and we see the message for the email field saying that a valid email is required. So now I know what I need to fix. And then under the submit button, we also have another message saying, please enter all required fields. So we've managed to update our form to be a little bit more user friendly, and we actually show some errors, and we're taking advantage of the state value from the useActionState hook. While we're on the topic of user experience, did you all notice what just happened? So I was a user and I had completed or correct fields when I submitted my form. And now that I have an error, it looks like I'm going to have to re-enter all those fields, even though at least 3 out of 4 of my fields were correct. This probably isn't the best user experience, right? Well, let's take a look at how useActionState can make this work to where we maintain what the user entered, even when the form is submitted and there is an error. So in our code, let's start by updating our type ContactForm state to include some inputs. So what are these inputs? These are going to be what the user entered or what they submitted in their form. So we're going to have our ContactForm state include these. So now that we have these included, we need to go into our action and update the return type for when there's an error to include these inputs. So if we do inputs and then we use the object dot from entries and then we do form data, we should start seeing our inputs come back to our client. So let's see what happens here. So if we go back to our browser, and now if we try to resubmit our form, let's see what we get. So now inputs should be here. So we can see inputs are there, they're empty. So let's see if we submit an actual input, will that retain in this state object that we're returning? So the input field is still clear, but if we go into our logs and try to see what's in here, you can see now that our first name field is retained. So now let's update our contact form to include this data. In our contact form, we made the following update. So all we did was add a simple default value to each of the input fields. So what does this mean? So whenever this value is set, that's what is going to display in the form field. If it's not set, it's just going to be empty like normal. So now that we have these fixes in place for each of our inputs for subject, email, first name, and last name, let's navigate back to the browser and actually see if these things are taking effect. So if we go into the browser and we submit a couple of fields, right, and we leave email address and subject empty, we should expect first name and last name to retain their state and not be cleared out. So let's submit our form. So you can see our change worked successfully. First name and last name are good, and the only things that we have to re-enter are the fields that are required. So that is how you maintain state or take advantage of the useActionState hook to maintain state of a submitted form. In regards to validation, you definitely want to have both server and client-side validation in your forms. Currently right now, we only have server validation. So we're going to simply add, for the sake of this example, we're going to add just the required tag to each of our input fields so we get the minimum browser validation. So going back to our contact form, we're literally just going to add the required keyword to each of our input fields. So we're going to have that for first name, last name, email, and subject. And so now we should have the minimum validation provided by the browser. Now you can see here we get an error. This is the default browser validation that we get just by adding the required keyword. As it stands right now, our form has the bare minimum requirements of server and client-side validation, but this can be greatly improved. There are a lot of things in this code that we can definitely improve. If we want more advanced validation, for example, we can take advantage of a library like Zod to handle client-side and server-side validation. And this will really make our lives easier and it can really give us an opportunity to improve our user experience. In an upcoming video, we'll be covering advanced forms using Zod. So don't forget to subscribe to the channel if you haven't already so you can stay up to date with the tutorials as they release. Let's talk about security in regards to server actions. So it's super important to note, by default, when a server action is created and exported, it creates a public HTTP endpoint and should have authorization checks in place to make sure users can invoke them. So this means in your server actions, it's up to you to ensure that a given user is authorized to perform a given action. So for example, checking their role, logged in status, verifying forward submissions, etc. Since server actions can be invoked through a form element, this opens them up to cross-site request forgery attacks or CSRF attacks. However, since server actions use the post method and can only be invoked by this method, this helps prevent most CSRF vulnerabilities in modern browsers. As an additional layer of protection, server actions in Next.js also compare HTTP headers. So this means that server actions can only be invoked on the same host as the page that hosts it. If it doesn't match, the action will be aborted. Hopefully these things shed some light on security in your server actions. In this video description, I'm also sharing a link to a very helpful document on the Next.js site that goes into great depth in security practices in the Next.js framework. And that's it. I know we covered a good bit of information in this video, and I hope you're able to see the power of server actions in Next.js. If you found this tutorial helpful, give it a thumbs up and subscribe if you haven't already, just so you don't miss out on future content. Like I say all the time, we have a lot more videos to go over. If you have a topic you want me to go over specifically, drop it in the comments. If you have a question, drop it in the comments. Try to respond to everybody. So yeah, by all means, interact with me. Until next time, happy coding. I appreciate y'all. Peace out.